I am thrilled to introduce Rachel Lyons. She is no stranger. If anyone joined us for avoiding burnout as a nonprofit employee, I know there were a lot of great nuggets we took away from that. And I'm sure today will be no different. We're so excited to have psychotherapy expert Rachel Lyons with us, covering how healthy boundaries can actually increase work productivity and provide more overall joy in both work and life in general. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Rachel Lyons.
Thank you so much. So today we're talking about boundaries, which I think is fun, but we'll see if you guys think it's fun too. So I'm curious, like, what do you guys think of when you think of boundaries? Any like initial thoughts come up? I would love for this to be as interactive as possible, so I'm not just like talking at you the entire time.
Pull up the chat box.
And you can also put it in the chat if that's easier. Okay, so hard to set in today's world for sure. Okay, so we'll go to a definition by Brene Brown, and she says that boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously.
You're a bit too quiet for a second.
Okay. I got feedback that I'm too quiet, so pulling this mic up a little bit. So what does this is showing the wrong. Oh, actually, no, it's not. Okay. So I'm curious, like maybe some of you are wondering what this has to do with you, and what this has to do with the nonprofit world. And so if you were at the last session, you may remember that boundaries are one of the ways we talked about to prevent compassion fatigue and burnout. And so that's kind of how it applies to you. And some people were like, hey, can you come back and talk about boundaries more in depth? Because I wasn't able to fully get into it last time. And so boundaries are really a prerequisite for compassion and empathy. And most people who are in the nonprofit world, they tend to be very compassionate and empathetic people. And when we don't know the difference between our own feelings and someone else's feelings, we cannot have empathy because we're just being swept away by our emotions. And some people think of empathy as like, I feel everything you feel. And that's actually not true. That's actually called enmeshment. And it's where we cannot distinguish between someone else's experience and our own experience. And it actually makes it really difficult to have empathy. And so I think it's important for us to first define like, what is empathy? And if you were here last time, I think I defined this then as well, but you'll get a little refresher. And Brene Brown defines it as an emotional skill. And I want to emphasize skill because it is something that we can learn. And it allows us to understand what someone is experiencing and to reflect back that understanding. It requires being curious about the other person, and asking like, what does this mean for you? Being non-judgmental, communicating understanding of their experience, and staying present in the moment. It is understanding what someone is feeling and not feeling it for them. So instead of, oh, that sucks for you, can't relate, and trying to like stay distanced from what someone else is going through, it is staying present. And we can only be empathetic when we're willing to be present with someone's pain, which can be really a difficult thing. And that can only be done effectively through having boundaries. And so this quote here says, we need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes. Rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell about what it's like in your shoes and believe you, even when it doesn't match my experiences. And so that's really what empathy is about. Any questions about that before we move on? Cries of outrage, maybe? I don't know. Okay, I'm checking the chat box. Somebody was saying expression of needs. Nailed it, Steph. Yes. Tech makes boundaries more challenging. Absolutely, it does. Yes, because, and we'll get into that, like technology makes people think that we are accessible at all times. And so it's up to us to like set those boundaries. And then somebody said parameters. Absolutely. And so just speaking a little more about empathy and non-judgment. And so what is judgment versus acceptance? The better we are at accepting ourselves and others, the more compassionate we become. And how can we accept others and be empathetic when they are hurting or taking advantage of us? And so this is really where boundaries come in, is if we're allowing others to hurt us, if we don't have any boundaries, then we're not able to have empathy for people because we hold resentment. Let me make sure I got everything on there. Yeah. Okay. So why do we need boundaries? A lack of boundaries can show up looking like being really sweet, but maybe not so authentic. So this can be like, bless your heart. We in the South love this one. And it can come across as passive aggressiveness, prioritizing being liked over prioritizing your own needs. It can also look like saying yes, but then having resentment towards the person who asked you. And so what happens when we don't have boundaries? We first say yes to too much. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this. It's difficult to say no, which is why we are having this topic in the first place. And so we say yes to way too much, and then we hit a breaking point and we're like, okay, I'm going to put my foot down. And often we do this in a very emotionally activated state. So when we finally hit our breaking point, we're like, ah, and we can blow up on the people around us. And it usually isn't super effective because then we feel embarrassed, we feel guilty and shameful about the way that we did it. We over apologize, we over explain, and then we're like, oh my gosh, that was a disaster. Just forget all of that. And we start the cycle over and we say yes to way too much. And here we go again. I'm sure none of you can relate to this, but I can personally. And so expressing clear boundaries is kindness. I just love this because I think a lot of times we think like maybe a few slides ago when I said we prioritize the needs of others over our own needs. Some of you were like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to be selfless. We are supposed to do everything for everyone else. And having boundaries is rude. It's mean. It's inconsiderate. It's selfish. And I actually want to like push on that a little bit and say that it's actually very kind to have boundaries. And so setting a boundary enables us to assert our own value. It's not about being mean or arrogant or inconsiderate. It's about knowing what you want, what your limits are, and then communicating that. And learning to say no is often the kindest thing you can do for yourself and those around you. So I want to just ask, like, how do we feel when someone isn't communicating that they're upset, but we can tell because their body language or their tone or like the way that they're acting with us, like we know they're upset, but they're not communicating it. And so that's often what happens with the lack of boundaries, is that like passive aggressiveness or, and it can make us feel very on edge around that person. We can sense that we've crossed a boundary, but we aren't sure what it is. And we may be worried about doing it again because it hasn't been communicated. And so expressing our boundaries can be really intimidating in the moment, but it results in more trusting relationships, whether that's like your work relationships, your family, your friends. And if I know that if I can feel confident that someone is going to express to me when I cross their boundary, then I can feel more settled in our interactions. And I don't have to have that hypervigilance of like, are they mad? Are they not mad? So it just like all around results in feeling less resentment and allows people to feel that we are trustworthy, we're solid, we're reliable. And we can do this in a way that is kind and clear. Again, it doesn't have to be something that's aggressive. It doesn't, in fact, it's better if it's not. And we can do it in a way that is very kind. And doing this also allows us to have more empathy and compassion again. And it allows us to be authentic. It helps us prevent compassion fatigue and burnout, and helps us to be just more effective, more productive at work and in our relationships through having that communication. Yeah, somebody said so frustrating. Yes, absolutely. This might have, I'm not sure what that was in regard to, possibly that cycle of like saying yes to too much, then getting frustrated, blowing up, feeling embarrassed, starting over. Absolutely such a frustrating process. I'll pause really quick. Any questions, comments, anything before we keep going?
Hey, Rachel, this is Jeannie.
Hi, Jeannie.
Hi. Hey, I'm just reflecting on, personal and professional relationships. And I feel like sometimes, like if this isn't the way your relationship has gone, like if you just go about your business, like I know you're mad, but I don't want to engage.
Yeah.
If you wait too long, and then you actually ask someone, it's like the floodgates just open up. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't even have time for this right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what's like, how do you kind of like stop that cycle of, that passive aggressiveness and without like kind of ruining or not ruining, but damaging a relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to get into that shortly. I even have like a sort of like a sentence stem of like what you can use to have those like really hard conversations that with relationships that are already established, and like we already have patterns, we already have a way of relating, and like maybe they're not working for me anymore. And so like how can I address these things in my relationships in a way that is productive and effective, and that is going to hopefully have the least amount of defensiveness and emotional dysregulation as possible. And also when we're setting boundaries, like there often will be emotional dysregulation. And so like, we're going to talk about how we can handle that. And as we go, just feel free to pop in any additional questions that you have. And so thanks, Jeannie. I really appreciate that. And we will get into it, I promise. And so, anger, we often think of as a bad emotion. And so again, I'm going to push against that a little bit and say that anger actually delivers us with really important information about where one of our boundaries has been crossed. So like next time you're angry, I would encourage you to get curious about that emotion, because our boundaries tell us about our beliefs and they help us to know ourselves better. When we restore our boundaries, we are honoring ourselves by living with integrity, peace, and power. We're also teaching people how to treat us, and how we treat ourselves is how we are teaching the people around us that we can be treated. Another helpful one that Glennon Doyle, who had that quote there, states is that how we treat ourselves is how we are teaching our children how they should be treated. And how we allow other people to treat us is how we are teaching our children that they should be treated. And so this applies to work and also home. And sometimes that in particular helps people to be like, oh, I don't want my child to be treated like that. And that can be a helpful one. And just realizing like why this is so important. So when boundaries are in place, we feel safer to express our authentic wants and needs, and we are better able to regulate our nervous system and feel safe. And we rid ourselves of the resentment that comes along with denying our essential needs. So it provides a necessary foundation for every relationship that you have, especially with yourself. And they protect you from things that feel inappropriate, unacceptable, inauthentic, or just unwanted. And I think it's really important to note that a lot of times when we think about boundaries and needing to do boundary work in general, we think about people who have really loose boundaries. And so this is like what you see here, the compulsive people pleasing. They use others' opinions to define their self-worth. They can't say no. They might overshare private information, and they can be our chronic fixers, our chronic helpers, savers, rescuers. None of these things are bad, by the way. It's just something to note. And then the other side of it, though, that we think about less is people who have really rigid boundaries. So these people have very few close relationships, a chronic fear of rejection. They have a huge difficulty asking for help and are fiercely private. And so I just thought it was important to note that like they're two ends of the spectrum. And so what I don't want is for you to hear like, your boundaries are too loose. And so then we go to like the other extreme, which is like way too much. And so what we're actually hoping for is to find a place with flexible boundaries. And so this is, I am aware of and I value my own thoughts, opinions, and beliefs. I can communicate my needs effectively. I can share personal information appropriately in the right settings and the right amount and with the right people who are safe. I am consistently able to say no when needed, and I accept others doing the same. That's a really important piece because boundaries go both ways. So if we're like, I'm going to start implementing boundaries, we need to be ready to like receive that in return as well. And be a safe place for people to feel that they're allowed to have boundaries as well. I'm able to regulate my emotions and I allow others to express themselves. So that's what flexible boundaries are. And here's a few examples of what that might sound like. I don't know if I'm allowed to say pissed, but okay. It's okay to be pissed. It's not okay to raise your voice and pound on the table. It's okay to change your mind. It's not okay to assume that I'm okay with those changes without talking to me about them. It's okay to disagree with me. It's not okay to ridicule my ideas and beliefs. So this is just like a few examples of what some flexible boundaries are. So it gives like the dialectic of, yes, it's okay to have emotions, but this, like, I'm not going to stay in the room if you're like pounding on the table and screaming at me. And so I hope those examples maybe helped a little bit. And then I also think it's really important to note that a boundary is not an ultimatum. So it is a personal limit. It is expressed to get our needs met. And it is an action we take for ourselves, regardless of how the other person reacts. It is what I will do when my boundaries are crossed. And the responsibility of upholding my boundaries is on me. It's not on the other person. And so, one, don't be surprised if people push back or are upset. That was a tongue twister. By your boundaries. And so instead of what are you going to do to meet my needs, which is an ultimatum, Instead, can we ask, what will I do to make sure my needs are met? So going back to our previous example, if you pound the table and yell, I will leave the room and we can pick the conversation back up later, could be a way to express that. And so notice that I removed myself. I did not tell the other person that they have to leave. The responsibility, again, is on me. And that's because we can't place the responsibility of our boundaries on others and expect it to be effective. Because again, then we're giving the other person that responsibility, and they may or may not uphold it. Does this make sense so far? Cool. Love the thumbs up. Let me check the chat really quick. Okay, all good. So now we're going to get into, all right, we figured it out. We know that boundaries are important. Get to the meat of it. So setting boundaries. The main thing that we need to think about is finding a time when both parties are emotionally regulated. So with our example of like, it's okay for you to be upset, just don't yell at me and pound the table. Probably not the best time to like set that boundary in the moment. Maybe you need to because of safety or whatever. But if this is like an ongoing thing that has happened, we are going to be most effective if we wait until both parties are calm and there's not like something going on in that moment. And that way we can clearly communicate the boundary. It's also very important that we focus on the facts and we use I statements rather than you did this and you made me feel this way. If we use I statements, again, it puts the responsibility on us. Because ultimately, when someone frustrates us because of a boundary being crossed, again, like it's our responsibility to do something about that, not theirs. Because again, they might not even know. And so we go into these conversations trying to be as confident and respectful as possible. And potentially you may need to continue restating how you will respond in the future. And so say you do get into the conversation and the person is upset, which can very likely happen. We remain present and calm and we continue saying like, this is what I will do if this does happen again, and not putting the burden on them. And then just resist the urge to over-explain. This can be a really hard one because we want to be like, well, this is like, tell all the reasons why and justify it. And the reality is like, this is your boundary. You don't have to justify it beyond like the basic, what's the word I'm trying to find? Beyond the basic description of this prompt that we're about to go into, like, you don't have to justify it. And it's okay if the other person doesn't understand. That can be hard to wrap our heads around. It's difficult for me. And so let's get into this little prompt. So I find this very helpful. I'll kind of read through it as it is here, and then I'm going to insert an example. And then if one of you is like, how would I do this? We can like work through it together and try to insert another example if someone finds that helpful. And so the prompt really goes, I'm making some changes so that, and then you insert your intention for your new boundary. And hope you can understand this is important to me. I imagine, and then we insert our understanding of their behavior. I often feel, and then here it's really important that instead of putting, I feel like, you don't understand me, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I often feel emotion. So I often feel frustrated. I often feel angry. I often feel sad. When you, and then you can insert the behavior there. Again, this is having the sentence in this way where it's, I often feel this, It's taking responsibility for the emotion and not putting it on the other person. I understand that it is something you may not be aware of. This is a really important line because, again, we're trying to have defenses down as much as possible because we don't want to come at somebody like, you this, and that, because that's just going to make them like, ugh, and they're not going to want to hear us. So in the future, insert what you would or would not like to happen. If insert original problematic behavior happens again, I will insert how you will respond differently to meet your own needs. So I'm going to insert an example to hopefully help flesh this out a little bit better. So I am making some changes so that I can recharge in the evenings and hope you can understand this is important to me. I imagine that the evenings are when you like to get some of your extra work done. I often feel frustrated when you call or email in the evenings. I understand that is something you may not be aware of. In the future, I would appreciate it if you waited to call me between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on the weekdays. If you do call or email in the evenings, I will wait until the next day to respond and address the issue. Does this kind of help like flesh that out a little of like what that might sound like? Okay. And I just picked like kind of like a random basic problem that someone might have. And hopefully that's helpful. Does anyone have anything that they're like, okay, I have this and I'm wondering like, how would I address this specifically? And we can potentially walk through it if somebody wants to do that.
So one of the biggest problems that we have is we deal with veterans with predominantly with traumatic brain injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And so their brain does not work like your brain works,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so
Absolutely.
you know what I mean? And so, I mean, it's just it's just a difficult thing to do, but I mean, it's doable. It's just, like I said, their brain doesn't work like our brains work. So it's very complicated with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and you don't have to answer any of these questions, but I'm just curious, is there a specific boundary that's being crossed that you feel like can't be addressed because maybe like they won't understand? Or
I mean, most of our guys are. I mean, when it comes down to stuff like this, most of our guys are very high suicide risk,
mm-hmm.
and because they are such a high suicide risk, nobody wants to deal with them because of the potential for them.
I think you may have broken up a little
And
bit.
so it's kind of, once, sorry, but most of our guys are very high suicide risk. And so that makes it a little bit more difficult for us, and so you're trying to get them to where they can do this kind of stuff. And so in the beginning, you can't really do this because you're just trying to get them to come to the table. And then after that, we try to establish some readiness for change, and I think that's kind of difficult for us sometimes.
Absolutely. Yes. So I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. And so I'm curious if what you're saying is that setting boundaries in the beginning of some of these relationships with veterans doesn't feel possible because it may discourage them from getting help. Is that what you're saying? Okay. I saw a nod, I think. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I can totally see how this could feel like a difficult conversation. And at the same time, I think that boundaries can be just as important, if not maybe even more important here, because it is such a high intensity relationship where we are worried about their safety. We're worried about like them getting the help that they need and doing so in a way that has boundaries and that is safe, and that we are able to maintain these relationships in a way that is most effective, would be through having boundaries. And so like these conversations are really difficult and are often very necessary, especially with these types of relationships. And this is something that I can relate to as well, with like having clients who have like high suicide risk and who I have to establish boundaries with them. And it's important for the work that we do, especially in helping relationships, where we are establishing really solid boundaries. And again, this is increasing our level of reliability for them, of knowing what to expect when they interact with us, of knowing what is and is not acceptable. And it's not leaving them high and dry without the resources that they need, without the help that they need. And instead, it's providing them with like, since I don't have a specific example of what you may be thinking, I'll just continue to use this sort of like phone call thing of maybe they're like calling you in the evenings, and this could potentially be like a high sensitivity situation where you're like, I need to answer this. They could be, there could be a threat of them like wanting to hurt themselves. The important thing is that like we're giving them the resources of the people who are available during that time. So like we're connecting them with therapists, we're connecting them with suicide hotlines, we're connecting them with mental psychiatric hospitals, and people who can actually do something in that situation. Because if you're sitting at home with your kids trying to eat dinner and this call happens, like, to be honest, there's not a lot you can do. And so like keeping that boundary loose, like it's not actually helping that person. It's actually preventing them from getting in contact with the people who actually can help them. And so it can feel very harsh. And also, again, like I just want to go back to like that this actually is kindness. Did I answer that question for you? Okay. And feel free, like if you have more questions or have more specific things that you're curious about, like feel free to reach out. I can put my email in the chat at the end of this, and feel free to shoot me an email if you need to. Okay, we will keep moving on. Oh, I see you chat. I often compromise my boundaries depending on who I am interacting with. Absolutely. So fellow coworker versus board member, from flexible boundaries to no boundaries, and working on balance. Yeah, that's what this is all about, is having balance. And also knowing again that like with some people, we can have flexible boundaries and we're able to do that. And then maybe no boundaries probably wouldn't ever result in like a great dynamic, I don't think. But this is something that, again, we find balance in, and knowing that like, I'm not going to have the same boundaries with my coworker as I do my best friend, as I do my spouse, as I do, like, it just depends on the relationship, exactly as you said, and being able to find balance in what works individually for each relationship. So maintaining the boundary, and I'm trying to, we're almost done. This is the last slide. So maintaining the boundary is about like the aftermath of setting that boundary. And so one, we recognize that the other person's expectations of you are being disrupted. And so they will likely react defensively. And as much as we try to prevent that, just know that it's still possible. and we acknowledge the thoughts that may be coming up. So this might sound like, I have no right to set this boundary. I am rude. I'm selfish. I'm mean for doing this. And again, we go back to that cycle of like, oh, this is disruption. And sometimes disruption is necessary. And also we acknowledge that it's really hard and these thoughts might come up when we're doing that. And that's totally normal. And so there will likely be a strong urge to go back on the boundary that you just set and that you just established and return to homeostasis. So this is like, even if it's dysfunctional, even if it's stressful, it can still be like our comfort zone and it can still be homeostasis because like that's what we're used to. That's the pattern that we have been in for so long. That's what is in our comfort zone. And so also acknowledging the other person's right to choose how to respond and how they want to engage moving forward. That's the great thing about boundaries is it is a two-way street. So acknowledging like, hey, I changed things up, like me setting this boundary, it changed the dynamic of our relationship. And so now the other person has their own right to choose like what's going to happen from there. And I encourage you to stay firm in your boundary, even when it gets hard. And this is because, again, like it teaches, if we don't stay firm in it, it teaches people that like my word doesn't matter, that I'll go back on what I said, that I don't mean what I say, and that I'm not going to respect my boundaries or yours. And so, again, even if we encounter rage, pushback, confusion, snarky remarks, a common one can be like, you've changed. It's like, yes, I have. I'm trying to grow and evolve as a person. And change is okay. And so here are the resources that I used. I used Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, which is a great read. I used a quote from Untamed, and I used a lot of How to Do the Work, Recognize Your Patterns, Heal from Your Past, and Create Yourself. And so here's some additional resources if you want to look more into boundaries for yourself and how this can apply to your life. The sentence stem, like the prompt that I used, was from this book, How to Do the Work by Nicole LePera. But all of these books are great and would recommend for anyone looking to do more of that on your own. And then as always, if you're looking for a therapist, you can go to psychologytoday.com to find someone near you. This is not an ad, but I just love therapy. So, and so if anyone has any questions, comments, whatever, feel free to ask those now or throw them in the chat. Yeah, somebody said Book of Boundaries is a fairly easy read and provides insights. Well, if no one has any questions or comments, okay. You're so welcome. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. Oh, I said I would put my email in here, so I'll do that.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your insights and perspectives. So helpful, so important to just take that moment to remember things that we might already know, but we push down and stuff. So really,
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me back.
All right, everyone. Well, as you know, we've got some great content out on LinkedIn. If you're not already following us, we encourage you to do so. The link and a QR code are listed there.